So we're back again to talk about the Kraft Insulin Survey. We haven't covered that enough. That's one of the two core labs that we get, a version of the insulin survey. And we got into some discussion about it the past couple of weeks. A lot of people started reacting. One of the folks, who was the responder that said, Rick Folia, I think, said, "Hey, wait a minute. Once you're on low carb, your pancreas forgets how to make insulin, and therefore you're going to look like you have a false positive. You look like you have diabetes, even though you may not." I haven't seen that. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that today, but before we do, we're going to get deeper into the entire the book, the Diabetes Epidemic in You by Joseph Kraft. If you haven't noticed, I've got a little bit of problems with allergies here in Greenville, South Carolina, one of the top 10 towns in the country for allergies. I inherited a bunch of allergies from my mom, so we will. I'm sure we'll be able to make it through. You just may hear me sounding like a frog. Jesus, why don't you take over?
Well, and that's gonna be good for your landings as well. Good morning to everyone. I'm sorry I don't have such a deep voice like Dr. Bruce today. No allergies issue for me, fortunately. So today, as Dr. Brewer mentioned, we're gonna cover if you should be tested for diabetes, and this is basically part of a review of Dr. Joseph Kraft. About that, the diabetes epidemic and you, which is a really interesting book about how insulin values do have a role on detecting diabetes. I'm going to discuss about that. A few weeks back, I also proposed Dr. Brewer to start covering some basic physiologic processes. And now that we have been talking about insulin and diabetes and glucose metabolism the last 3 weeks, I thought it was a good idea to mention a little bit about insulin and glucagon metabolism, just some basic stuff, and then we can go over and see a little bit more about lipids and insulin resistance and other stuffs. And as Dr. Brewer mentioned, we have a viewer, Rick Folia, who we appreciate his support and his comments. And he talked about that issue of low carb diet and diabetes. And I just added a short slide to close that part of the conversation, so to say, after 3 weeks on this series of low carb diet and diabetes. Other topics, if you're new to this channel, we are all about prevention, cardiovascular prevention of a heart attack and stroke. And as I mentioned, we last week covered low carb diet and risk of diabetes. Before that, we covered fasting and anti-aging drugs effects on diabetes, which is it was a really good discussion about some of the kind of new anti-aging drugs, such as we talk about everolimus and which one was the other one? Resveratrol, and I forgot the other one.
Sirolimus, resveratrol,
Sirolimus.
Rapa Nui, rapamycin.
Yeah,
Now you're having
rapamycin.
senior moments, Jesus.
Yeah, yeah.
Enjoying them.
I think I didn't get my 8 hours of sleep last night. And life purpose and lifespan, which is a really interesting topic. If you haven't heard about that, it's like you're talking about prevention. Why are you going into that more humanistic side of the aisle? And you will discover that having a life purpose and does have an impact on the lifespan that you have and the risk of cardiovascular disease. There are a couple of really interesting articles on that side. YouTube is our main channel, but we would also have a network of folks on locals and Rumble. So if you're seeing the show from Rumble, we appreciate that. If you're here on YouTube, we do appreciate that as well. Locals have some exclusive content that you want to check out, and we added this short slide about being a YouTube member. So um, as you know, if you have followed the channel, you know what that the end, the last part of the channel is basically a Q&A section. And we sometimes struggle on getting to see all the questions from everybody. So what we started pushing was, hey, if you want us to answer your question before, hit us with a super chat. But Rick Folia mentioned something really interesting, that we do have a lot of YouTube members, and there's a way for us to see that. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna also prioritize comments and questions from people who are already YouTube members. That's another perk that we wanna have for you if you're a member. And I will take a 1 second to give a shout out to Angel Rodriguez as a new YouTube member. Thank you so much. So contents, questions from people who send a super chat or our YouTube members are gonna go first. And you can see how to join. Just click on the subscribe button or on the button next to the subscribe button. So you will become a member of the YouTube channel. That helps us a lot. That supports the channel big time. And the not so new book, but which is a really interesting book about how stress tests are not going to help you prevent a heart attack. A stress test usually might give you a false sense of safety if they go okay, if you they told you that you don't have any issues. And we have stories of people, even famous people, who have had heart attacks after having a normal stress test. So Prevention Myths book, it's all about that. It's all about knowing what to do exactly to prevent a heart attack and stroke. For those who want to reach out and be part of Dr. Brewer's group of patients, we are accepting traditional Medicare. This has been a huge success. We have been booking week after week a lot of patients who now are able to access the services from Dr. Brewer uh, through the Medicare program. Dr. Brewer just left. He might come back. Maybe some tech issues just in there. So if you are a Medicare beneficiary and you want to get world class medical attention by Dr. Brewer and the team, go ahead and call us. Can you show the phone number, Gilbert, please, so they know where to reach out? You can send us an email, you can go into the website, or you can just call us and we will be happy to put you on the waiting list. 859-721-1414. We have a lot of patients and all people asking, hey, I would like to see a primary doc or a doctor near me that has the same ideas as Dr. Brewer has. And we're working on that. We're building this physicians network and doctors network on prevention. We're not there yet, but we're really working on that. And we are confident that in a couple of months, we may be able to start growing this network bigger and bigger. Is everything okay, Doc?
I've had a couple. I got bumped out and then back in. I'm trying to see if I can find my sign up. Maybe that'll give me more secure access. But hang in there.
Okay. Okay. And just a quick shout out to Full Scripts. We have been working with them for a couple of months now, and it's basically a good source for you to get some access to supplements. You know, supplement industry is not as followed or scrutinized as medications. So it's easy to get some supplements from sketchy sources that can be actually unsafe for you, unhealthy. So FullScripts provides a good platform to get access to some good quality supplements if you're looking for those. Just look for Dr. Brewer's protocols and you will see some of the supplements that Dr. Brewer recommends. So we're going to the short topic for today, which is basically a little a little insight on how insulin and glucagon and glucose metabolism works. Um, as you know, and I want to start this short journey on the pancreas. As you know, the pancreas is the organ that produces insulin, and the main factor outside of the pancreas that promotes the creation and secretion of insulin is hyperglycemia, high levels of blood glucose. So every time you have blood glucose levels rising after a meal or just consistently high, you're going to stimulate the pancreas to produce insulin. Now, there are some things called Langerhans um, islands, or
Islets of Langerhans.
yeah,
Right.
and that's where the insulin name comes from insula, which is kind of island. That's
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's why they call them insulin. Some
Very
things,
interesting.
some things are more logical than others. The, like the Rapa Nui stuff, it's really good for
Yeah.
rapamycin, and yeah, kind of the
Yeah.
same stuff, right? So we have alpha cells, we have beta cells, we have gamma, epsilon, other stuff of cells. Pancreas produces different types of hormones. This is the endocrine part of the pancreas, but it also has an exocrine component, which is basically secreting some substances to the gut so you can digest some of the products. That's the part that works outside the pancreas. But inside the pancreas, hormone is basically a substance that is produced on one organ and works in another one. So that's what
So,
insulin does.
so just a 30-second review. Jesus is going into the anatomy and physiology of the pancreas. And the pancreas has two different components, the endocrine and exocrine. In basic science in med school, I never quite, I mean, I memorized it, but I didn't totally understand. Exocrine is um, things that help us digest food. Endocrine is things that harm us, like insulin. And we'll talk a little bit about the glucagon in just a minute.
Yeah,
So,
and maybe yeah. Go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The
I
insulin
interrupt
comes
you.
from the islets of Langerhans, which Jesus just pointed out. Insulin uh, are isolated island. Very interesting.
And maybe I should have changed the image that I just hit there for the pancreas because I was focusing more on the endocrine side. But just so you know, a little bit anatomy, the pancreas have different parts. And the bigger part is the basically the head of the pancreas, so to say. And the intestine, part of the intestine like kind of goes outside the pancreas. So they are connected through a duct, and that's where substances from pancreas go there and help you digest part of the food that you have eaten. So going back to the endocrine side, as you see there, there's a balance between insulin and glucagon. Basically, insulin has some functions like helping use that glucose that goes into the blood. It produces fat tissue. It helps promoting fat tissue production. It helps both breaking glucose storage and also helping storage more glucose in the liver and some of that on the muscles as well. Glucagon is exactly the opposite thing. So whenever blood glucose rises, insulin goes there and helps the cell getting that glucose inside and taking or using that glucose. Glucagon might be produced when you have low levels of blood glucose, but that doesn't happen all the time. But it also gets stimulated wherever insulin goes on lower levels. So it's basically a balance that will help you. If you have a high level of blood glucose, insulin is going to help with that. If you have low levels of blood glucose, glucagon is going to help with that to raise the amount of blood glucose that you have. So you don't suffer from hypoglycemia, which is low level of glucose in the blood, basically. So they are opposites. That's part of the balance. Endocrinology is all about this. One hormone that does one thing, another hormones that does the opposite things, and keep that as a balance. So I'm gonna move to the next slide real quick and show you a little bit about the functions that insulin does have. So one thing is for sure, if somebody comes here and tells you, hey, we do know all about how insulin works, they're lying to you. There's still research going on. There's still some stuff that we don't know about insulin, but there's stuff that we do know. And we do know that insulin works with certain receptors on the cell, and that helps the glucose molecules go into the cell and get used to produce energy or as energy storage. And as you see on the image, there are three main organs that you should take a look at when talking about glucose. One is the liver. So whenever you have high levels of blood glucose, insulin rises and helps to storage part of that glucose, helps to some of that storage glucose, which is kind of packed, being unpacked and sent to the bloodstream to be used elsewhere, and also helps transform that glucose into triglycerides, which is another form of storage energy. And that's why you should understand now why if you high levels of triglycerides, it's not necessarily for you eating fat. It's actually for you eating high amounts of carbohydrates that get converted into glucose, and that glucose gets converted through triglycerides. And insulin has a role in that as well.
And never burning that fat.
Definitely. Yeah, because insulin is not going to help you to burn that fat. It's going to help you create that and storage that, but it's not going to help you to break that down.
Speaking of the physiology of insulin, there are three major physiology components. And as Jesus has said, there's more. We just don't understand all of it. One of them is the obvious one. It's helping blood sugar get out of the blood and into the cells. The second one is not so obvious. I'll skip that one and just and go to the third one, which is very uh, not obvious. Insulin is actually used by our brain to form memory. And if you look at some of the academic centers, Wake Forest down in the Southeast has done a lot of work trying to help people with cognition problems just by snorting insulin. It didn't work. So that those studies have gone by the wayside. But here's the second component of insulin, second mechanism. It stops you from burning fat. So that's one of the things that happens quite a bit in terms of human physiology and insulin resistance. If you get to where you have to have higher and higher and higher levels of insulin in order to keep your blood sugar down, those higher levels of insulin are stopping you from burning fat. So one of the things that we look for uh, when we're looking at, we look at lipid panels too, the cholesterol panels. We look for high levels of triglyceride. The first thing that we start talking about is, okay, what's going on with their insulin? Do they have a high basal or fasting insulin? Are they constantly in a position where that insulin's just not letting them burn fat? It reminds me of the title of the book and the concept, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, by Gary Taubes. He says, we assume that as we get middle-aged, we're getting fat because we're eating more. That's not really what's happening. The exact opposite is happening. We're eating more because we're getting fat. In other words, we're getting insulin resistant. It's requiring more and more insulin to get that sugar out of the blood. So the insulin levels are getting higher and higher. Then with high insulin levels, we can't burn the major source of energy, triglycerides. So triglycerides start going higher and higher and higher. So how do you reverse that spiral, that death spiral that's killing and disabling more people than anything? Stop the things that cause increased insulin. Stop eating the carbs. So I thought I'd go back and connect a few dots for you there, Jesus.
And if you see, thanks a lot, Doug. If you see on the image to the right where it says adipose tissue, which that's basically fat tissue, you see a
Triglycerides.
you see a red line from insulin to an arrow that says lipolysis. Lipolysis is basically breaking that storage fat to use that as an energy. Insulin blocks that. So if you have higher levels of insulin, you are storing energy as fat and you are not letting the body use that as energy fuel. That's just backing up or complementing what Dr. Brewer said about that. That's the root, the issue there. Higher levels of insulin not only are promoting creating fat, are not letting the body burn that fat. So that's a really big issue. And insulin does play a role also on how muscle uses energy. This is with muscle on a resting state because when you're doing exercise, you trigger other metabolism chains. But on resting state, insulin does promote having some glucose energy use on muscle and having some storage of glucose within the muscle as well. It's not as much as in the liver, but it does that as well. And insulin helps you also not to burn protein. So that's a good side from insulin. But remember, if you have higher and higher and higher levels, also the function from insulin can be decreased. There are certain transporters and cell mediators. One of them is called serine. I gotta hit serine threonate or threonase, which is basically kind of an enzyme, and that gets triggered whenever you have inflammation, whenever you have persistent high levels of blood glucose. It gets affected when you have mitochondrial damage as well, and that's how inflammation promotes insulin resistance. It's basically messing up with the uh, mechanics of the cell on transmitting information and using all these molecules to do the things they should do. Glucagon, on the other hand, basically does all the opposite stuff that you see here. It does promote using fatty acid, it does promote breaking up adipose tissue, it does promote more creating storage of glucose and having more glucose in the blood as well. So that's basically part of the balance that you must see here. But insulin, as you know, or as you see here, has a lot of stuff going on in all the places. And now to add another layer of complexity to this issue, insulin doesn't work alone. There are other hormones that are being produced on the liver, on the pancreas, such as amylin, somatostatin, and there are other glucose that are produced on the gut. One of those we talked about a lot, the glucagon-like peptide one. So now you see why GLP-1s are a big deal, because GLP-1s exert the opposite effect of insulin, and though they're going to help you to promote uh, part of the increased sensitivity to insulin that we need. The other one that I want to mention real quick is GIP. That's promoted on the gut as well. Initially, it was thought that this hormone decreased gastric movement, and by decreasing gastric movement, the amount of glucose that you eat was going to reach higher levels of the blood glucose more slowly. So that's how that was controlled. Recently, researchers discovered that that's not the case, so they just changed the name. Instead of being gastric inhibitory polypeptide, GIP, they wanted to keep the name or the acronym, and they changed the name to glucose dependent insulinotropic polypeptide, which is basically an hormone that stimulates insulin. And we have other hormones like cortisol, epinephrine, growth hormone that stimulate uh, the amount of glucose that you have on the blood to be used, especially on the morning in the case of the cortisol, epinephrine in the case of stress, and that can decrease the amount of insulin or the effects of insulin on that amount of blood glucose. So if you see here, the complexity is really, really high, and all of this is happening right now. It's happening every second, and the main reason that you see all of these processes being disrupted is the amount of glucose that you eat every day and the capacity that your body has to metabolize that glucose. Anything that you want to add, Doc?
Sure. Good point. So, what I was going to say is when you're younger, you have all of these things working a lot better. You can tolerate a lot more glucose. As we get older, we get we lose function in different areas of this space. One of the biggest ones being our responsiveness, our cells' responsiveness to insulin, as we'll see a little bit later when in the long form content. So as we age, higher and higher levels of glucose in our diet become more and more of a toxin or a poison to us. So we just have to be aware of that and change our diet accordingly. That's all we have to do. And that takes the risk right off the table.
There's one concept I didn't mention: cellular stress. So, cellular stress is like when you are overloading the machine and you're putting too much of a resource than what the machine can manage. And as Dr. Brewer mentions, when you're young, your body is able to keep up with that. But as we age, cells age as well, and they lose that capacity to metabolize carbs as they used to.
Before you go on, let me just mention autophagy. Autophagy is so important, so needed, and it's something that you mentioned in the very beginning. Our body is all about achieving the correct balance. Well, when you look at the obesity epidemic and the amount of insulin resistance that and diabetes that's driving, it helps you understand why autophagy is so important, so healthy for so many people, because it's bringing your body back into the balance that it needs. Obesity is just a failure to achieve the appropriate balance that's needed for health. You've got too much insulin going on. It's an oxidative state, it's an inflammatory state, and it's a state that drives inflammation and damage to the artery walls.
And just to add to that comment, Doc, just the basic stuff on metabolism, and many people, I believe, already have heard this before. We have aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism. Aerobic metabolism is basically using glucose and oxygen to produce energy. Anaerobic metabolism is using maybe glucose, but maybe other stuff like ketone bodies or fat to produce energy without oxygen or less oxygen. Producing energy with oxygen and glucose, it doesn't take that much energy from the body to do that process and produces a lot of energy. Going through the other route requires the body to use some energy to produce less energy than with the aerobic component does. So it only makes sense if you consider that if you are overloading the machine on the aerobic side with high levels of blood glucose and trying to get that mitochondria working on that side nonstop, but because it has a lot of glucose to burn, if you shift your metabolism to the other way around and get this side to get some rest and burn all that storage energy that you have on fats on the other hand. So it's easier said than done, but it's possible.
And one of the it's simple, but again, not easy. It's getting the carbs that your body's overreacting to, getting those out of your diet. Then once you do that, you start getting some decrease in your appetite, and you start eating less, and then you start achieving that autophagy, getting back into that balance, more of that aerobic state.
And going through that route, what happens when the insulin stops working or when the pancreas is not producing enough insulin? Because that's the other thing. We do need some insulin. And what we want to do with insulin is that you have the less that you need to produce the better effects. The more insulin that you need, the more resistant you are. So Rick Folia shared this with us. This is from an article from Joseph Kraft on 1975. When he was and we're gonna go deeper into that later on. But when he was describing some of the patterns that he saw on the insulin surveys, on the insulin essays that he did, he mentioned this: in the absence of pancreatic gland dysfunction, meaning a pancreas that is working correctly, low insulin with normal to borderline glucose suggests low carb diet preparation and or management prior to an oral glucose tolerance test and insulin survey. So this is, I believe this is where the recommendation from carb loading comes from. And Rick Foley pointed that out really, really appropriately. In these cases, a standard high carbohydrate diet preparation for 2 or more weeks followed by a repeat tolerance examination was necessary to uncover the true insulin response pattern. Now, what I see here, there are two things. Number one, if you're or you're not a low carb diet and you are 5, 8, 9, 10, 15 years old and you don't have enough insulin, it is very likely that you have type 1 diabetes, meaning your pancreas is not producing enough insulin for your body to handle the amount of glucose that you eat every day. That's one. And we have a lot of patients that go low carb and they say, I got an OGTT, only glucose, no insulin, and my glucose levels went through the roof. So they think, one, that low carb diet is causing diabetes, or that low carb diet is causing false diabetes because they didn't have that types of responses in the past. And the logic behind, I'm basically summarizing last week's shows. The logic behind that was the pancreas on a low carb diet doesn't know how to produce more insulin. So whenever you put them more glucose in the body, they don't know how to handle that. The pancreas doesn't know how to handle that. There's not enough insulin, and that's what happens. So that's why they're suggesting, okay, just eat more carbs, train your pancreas a little bit more a few days before, and you will get the real response. That's what they are assuming. On the other hand, what I think that might be happening with somebody who has low carb diet and has high levels of blood glucose but low insulin levels, I think one of two things might be happening, and Dr. Brewer might have a different opinion than me. One thing that I think is maybe the lab did not test correctly. Maybe they did it. Maybe they did measure the fasting glucose 3 or 4 times, and we have seen that a lot.
Yeah.
Instead of measuring insulin in 1 hour, 2 hours, they get 3 vials for the fasting insulin, and they just report that 3 times. And that doesn't mean that you don't have enough insulin, and you will see how fasting insulin can be misleading if that's viewed alone. The other thing that I think might be happening is if you do have some variations and your blood glucose is rising, um, and that part, I'm not sure. I don't see that. I don't think that's going to be explained that often. What I think is happening is if you have higher normal levels of blood glucose and low levels of insulin, maybe that insulin is sensitive enough to keep your blood glucose as low as possible. Thoughts?
Yeah. So I get the logic. And for a long time, I never understood the logic behind it. And I appreciate Rick's focus on it. The logic is if you never stimulate your pancreas by never eating carbs, then it's going to forget to make insulin. The reality is, I don't think any of us are at a point to where we never stimulate our pancreas. Even folks with on a carnivore diet, I think there's still just too much opportunity to get very small amounts of stimulus. The bigger issue is, even though I understand the theory, I just don't see it. I've never seen it happen. Maybe I'm seeing it happen and I'm misinterpreting, but I'm not sure that's the case. As Jesus mentioned, we do see a lot of episodes where patients have they have very low insulin production from the beginning to the end. Now, there are two ways to two variations of that. The first variation is their blood sugars go up 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350. Those are people that they're at type 4, level 4 or 5 insulin, diabetes, where they're just not making insulin. And it's taking forever for their blood sugar to settle out. Now, help me with the logic on the other group. The people who have a much more normal value with their, when they have insulin levels that come across all 3 times at 5. You mentioned a possibility that they've become very, very insulin sensitive. I'm a little bit skeptical of that, and especially after having a couple of reasons. Number one, you'll see their numbers from the previous year, and they were getting up, not full blown diabetic, but their blood sugars were getting, they'd start at 90 to 110. Then that 1 hour peak would get up to like 170, and then they'd get back down to 130 at 2 hours, with a normal, what you would expect for an insulin, getting up, starting at 20, 15 to 20, a little bit higher than optimum, then getting up to like 60 or 80, and then getting back down to 40 or 50. This year, they come across as 5, 5, 5, and same glucose values as last year. To me, that's telling me that's much more likely to be a lab error. And then I had my own experience that I shared with you and with the group, where the lab tech did exactly that to me when I was getting mine, where she came in, she got the glucose values correctly, but on the third lab draw, I saw her fill 5 different small vials. And I asked her what those are for, and she said, "Those are your insulin values." I said, "Yes, but you just did them all at this one time." And she said, "Well, I know that doesn't make sense, does it?" And I said, "Correct. It doesn't make sense." And she said, I that's what I thought. So I called the national help desk, the lab tech help desk, and they said, "No, draw all of the insulins at one time." So we've just gotten to where we're very open about that. We communicate that to our patients where we can. And in fact, Jesus, we probably ought to put a little bit of a comment in those directions where we talk about, you may want to try a carb load. You also may want to keep an eye on the technician, the lab tech, and make sure that they're not following wrong advice.
Yeah, and we have some patients, and we have some people that say that, well, I want to try both. Let's see by myself, because the truth is also there's not enough research on this field. I haven't seen a study that searches specifically for this on this specific manner. You see a lot of HOMA IR studies, you see a lot of insulin clamp studies, but you don't see that much with OGTT and insulin survey.
Yeah. And I'm also trying to think of other situations that might either prove or disprove it. I've got plenty of diabetic patients. I've got plenty of patients that are, pre-diabetes. I just haven't seen one where that scenario has happened. As you mentioned, we had one last week who actually showed us his results, carb loading and non-carb loading. And in my mind, they really did not change dramatically one year to another.
Yeah, it's not like you see somebody who is on low carb, doesn't carb load and has diabetes, and when they carb load, they are like normal.
Yeah, I've just not seen.
There is always an insulin resistant component, and you have to measure both things, because that's the other issue. We presented an article where they measured only glucose. They completely ignored insulin levels. So the interpretation is incomplete. You don't know how the insulin is actually behaving with that amount of glucose as well. All right. So if we don't have anything else to add, we can go to the long content, Doc.
If you'll give us the water ball. Before we get into the long form presentation, I'll just share a little bit more. You may have noticed Jesus asking if I was all right a few minutes ago. I was unable. I did get thrown out again. I was able to get back in quickly. I was unable to get in the first time. We had password problems, and about 2 to 3 minutes prior to the show starting, we still didn't have me on the system. So another component that's happened with that is I'm unable to control the slides. So now Jesus has all the power.
Well, it is what it is. Okay, so we're gonna talk about if you should be tested for diabetes, and we chose this title because right off the bat, it's like we're disagreeing with Dr. Kraft's book on the title because we're saying yes, you should be tested for diabetes, and if you look at the Dr. Kraft's book, it says should everyone be tested? Absolutely not. Only those concerned about their future. So that's what we say. If you're on this channel, it's definitely you're concerned about your future, and you definitely should be tested for this. So, Dr. Kraft, on this really simple, really easy read book, it's like 100 and something pages. Dr. Kraft outlines the history of diabetes and the discovery of insulin and its essays. He relates over almost 15,000 essays that he did between 72 and 1998. And he is a big advocate of the use of the oral glucose tolerance test and insulin survey or insulin response to detect insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and diabetes. And he's one of those first people who started doing an objective work on promoting the measurement of insulin and considering that for diagnosis of diabetes, not just fasting glucose. And on that time, A1C was not a big thing either. So a brief history on this side. This is something that you can find on the book. Insulin was discovered in 1922 by Banting and McLeod, and in 1975, Dr. Stout identified hyperinsulinemia, high levels of insulin, with normal glucose tolerance as a cause of arterial damage. And Dr. William Hostler, he was a big person in medicine. He promoted some of the more important teachings on medicine all for everybody. He anticipated that in 1892. He started to mention how somebody of 40 years, 50 years might have arteries of somebody with 80 or 90 years just because of inflammation and damage to the artery wall and damage to the vessel because of inflammation. We know that from that time already. Insulin assays or insulin surveys provide critical information even in people with normal glucose levels. And that's the thing. And we saw that last week with the example that we showed how this person had normal fasting glucose levels, but had insulin through the roof as well. So that's the thing, the impact
Just
of insulin resistance.
a quick comment about William Osler. He was I think, the head of medicine at Hopkins, the most famous doctor over the past 300 or 400 years. He's the one who's got the famous quote. They're sitting around he's in the amphitheater, that oak-lined amphitheater that's so classic for doctors doing grand rounds, and a young doctor's presenting a patient. He got impatient, as he often did. He jumped up, slammed his hand on the counter, and said, "Doctor, just listen to your patient. He's telling you the diagnosis." And that's been a battle cry for doctors: listening, thinking with a prepared mind, and talking to the patient, as opposed to just getting labs.
That's for sure. And if you see the graph to the right, real quick, you see how insulin resistance can mediate two mechanisms. One, either inadequate insulin secretion or compensatory hyperinsulinemia, which is what you see more often. And inadequate insulin secretion, it doesn't mean low insulin. It can be also hyperinsulinemia. And that leads to type 2 diabetes and syndrome X, which is basically metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, and that leads to heart disease. So, important to mention how fasting insulin has limited value. It's important, but it's not it's alone. It doesn't provide you all the information. Fasting insulin is not too different between non-diabetic and diabetic persons, and that happens with fasting glucose as well. So, on the book, Dr. Kraft established a normal insulin value between 0 and 30. And they mentioned that less than 8% of people with hyperinsulinemia or type 2 diabetes will have fasting values over 30. We do recommend optimal fasting insulin values below 5. We're kind of more strict on that definition. Remember that normal is a statistical term. It's the most common, and sometimes normal is not healthy. So, how would you describe the Kraft Insulin Survey? Well, it requires fasting for at least 12 hours, measuring fasting glucose and insulin, drinking 100 grams of a sugar solution. How do you call that, Doc? Sugar
Glucola.
glucola, and measuring glucose and insulin. And Dr. Kraft uh, reported this reported it this way: 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, up to 5 hours. So we're talking about 7 draws, which can be difficult.
So for patients that routinely go to get our labs, most of them go to their local Quest. We had to go through a lot of work for a couple of years to get Quest to do the format that they currently do for us, and when they do it correctly. And that is 3 draws, fasting, 1 hour, and 2 hours, and 75 grams of glucose as opposed to 100.
Yeah, and that's the difference between the insulin response and the Kraft insulin survey. As you see, the Kraft can provide more information, but it's harder to be done for both the technician and the patient.
And it takes 5 hours. Could we go back to that previous slide for a second? Um, so you talked for a minute about fasting insulin. There's a lot of people that sort of lean a little bit academic that say HOMA IR um, is the real thing that you need, and that's a ratio between fasting glucose and fasting insulin. As you said, the bottom line is that does not work. You really need to stress the carb metabolism, your body's ability to do that. So when somebody tells you they got HOMA IR or that that's the thing, be very afraid. They don't know what they're talking about. They're obviously not doing plenty of these tests, so they haven't seen um, what we've seen.
Yeah.
Another thing, I'll just, while I'm talking about it, is fasting glucose. You know, doctors these days will routinely say, we don't use fasting glucose, we use A1C. Well, if they actually did use A1C, that would be better than fasting glucose. But as we've said, the American Academy of Clinical Endocrinologists have agreed and said that's not a great way to diagnose diabetes because it's a hemoglobin test. Back to the daily doctor and daily practice, and the vast majority of diabetes when the diagnosis is made. If you look at the science, you look at the evidence, it's usually made with fasting glucose. Now, that says a couple of things. Typical docs don't do what they're saying. You know, doctors are like people. You know, we think we're doing one thing when we're doing something else. And the other thing that it says is both are wrong. Now, when I say both are wrong, just using A1C or just using fasting insulin, both are wrong. And let me give you a couple of other facts from the science to help underline that. By the time the average diagnosis of diabetes is made, between 1 and 2/3 of people already have damage to their eyes. And over half of people already have some nerve damage. So what does that tell you? One thing it tells you is that even in a prediabetes phase, you can get injury to tissues. There's no question about that. The other thing that it tells you is we're making the diagnosis way too late. Why? Because we're waiting till it pops up on a fasting glucose that was gotten for some other reason. Had they actually done this test, we would be catching it much earlier and catching it before you get damage to eyes and nerves and arteries. So thank you for letting me go on that diatribe.
It was necessary because we have seen plenty of examples of people who have acceptable levels of A1C, normal fasting glucose levels, and when we challenge them with OGTT and insulin response, they are full blown diabetic, and they just didn't know that, and they didn't wait, expected that, and in the recommendations, instead of saying, okay, let's do another test that can be more sensitive on identify diabetes before it starts causing trouble, the recommendation is, oh, when you have diabetes, go ahead and check your eyes when you're diagnosed, because they already know that you will have damage already,
Yep.
instead of focusing on detecting pre-diabetes and insulin resistance before that happens. Whenever you already have eye damage, most of that is really, really hard to get back from, because that's nerve damage. And nerves do not recover as easily as other parts of the body.
We had a patient a few weeks ago that said, I think it was a female, and she said, I got so frustrated with my doctor, and um, she didn't have full blown diabetes, but she had a very significant prediabetes, and she said her A1C was in the very low fives, and she said, because my doctor didn't give me the OGTT or the insulin response test, he said, look at your hemoglobin A1C. It's fine. It's really, really good. And she kept saying, but I don't eat any carbs. And it's like the doctor could not connect the dots that A1C was going to be low if you're not eating any carbs.
That's correct. And that happens all the time.
It doesn't happen. It happens all the time. But the other thing that happens even more is somebody comes in with a fasting glucose of 90, and the doc's been telling them from day one, you're great. You've got no problem at all. And sure enough, they've got they've got a full blown diabetes.
5 to 7 years, I think, is the average. So you're
Yeah,
having someone with normal fasting blood glucose, and 3 4 years it starts to pick up and rise and rise and rise, and they tell them, I like the way you said, like a touch of sugar,
yeah.
110 and 115, and then it's 126. Oh, you have diabetes now. Well, you had insulin resistance for 8 years before that, and they didn't do anything, and you were not able to do anything about that. And we did have a patient yesterday, if you remember, a patient that was on low carb diet, but she had high levels of LDL, and the response from the physician was, well, you should start eating carbs. It's like, well, definitely different schools of teaching methods and perspectives on the same issue.
So the a little bit more detail for those that didn't connect the dots. So this was a lean mass hyper responder that we saw yesterday. She knew enough about this space to have a strong suspicion that she was. She had no other family members with significant high levels of LDL, and she had never had a significant. She'd had levels in the 120s, 130s, but then once she went low carb, her LDL went up to one in the 190s, and she was talking about it with her primary care doctor, and the primary care doctor said, "Well, just start eating carbs again, get that LDL back down." So she was not happy. The patient wasn't.
Definitely, she's changing docs now, I think.
Yeah.
Well, going back to the topic, and I'm sorry I went into that side, but it's part of the process on how most doctors don't know how to diagnose insulin resistance and diabetes or pre-diabetes, and let alone manage that. If you see here the Kraft insulin patterns, this is the types of response that are on the book from Dr. Kraft. So pattern one is normal. Pattern one is normal, fasting glucose below 30, peak at 30 minutes to 1 hour, and 2 to 5 hours less than 60. Now, if you have this doesn't mean that you don't have or you didn't have diabetes in the past. If you're managing stuff, you're likely to have a pattern like this one. This is the normal one or the optimal one, let's say. Pattern two, hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistant, fasting insulin below 30, as we mentioned. A lot of people might be on normal fasting insulin levels, peaking at 30 minutes and 1 hour, but after 2 to 5 hours, it stays above 60. So this is the ranges that Dr. Kraft describes in the book.
So let's go back if we could.
Sure.
Since I can't control it myself now, you have all the power. So these bars are the insulin levels, and the thin line is the glucose level.
It's I think the thin line is just a reference, but I'm not sure. No, just the reference.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Pattern three. Pattern three. You will see the progression in here. Pattern three, fasting insulin is still normal, but now we have a delayed peak. It's not happening at the 30 at 1 hour. It's happening. The peak is happening at the 2 and 3 hours, and you have a delayed return to fasting ranges. So what's happening here? Your insulin level is rising, but it's rising slowly. So meaning between the 30-minute and 2 hours, you're still having really high levels of blood glucose, and your insulin is not kicking in when it's supposed to. And pattern four, uh, now in pattern four, you see high levels of fasting insulin. So see how you should be driving from pattern one, pattern two, pattern three until on pattern four, you will see affected fasting insulin level, a delayed peak, and a delayed return to fasting ranges after that. So that's the description of insulin resistance, basically. Insulin that is being raised lately and is not efficient enough, and it stays high because it needs to work harder. And pardon the typo here. This is pattern five, not pattern four. Pattern five. All values fasting 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hour, 5 hours, or in the range of 0 to 30. That means a low insulin response. And the glucose values matter because that's the interpretation that you're going to have. If the glucose levels are normal or if the glucose levels are high. And I added this one. I don't think Dr. Kraft put this on the book. We put this. Consider the lab attack error on this case is on pattern 5. And we are adding here the optimal OGTT values. But see here, this is not the values that the guidelines use for diagnosis of diabetes. These ones are the optimal OGTT values that we propose. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doc, on these ones.
So what I'm going to ask, I didn't have when we were reviewing these this morning. What I'd like to do is go back and do the full pattern where we have the insulin value and the glucose value. And
Yeah.
let's go ahead and add that because it's a very, very helpful, insightful underlying thing to be able to see what the insulin is doing and to see how so for example, you get that loss of the first phase of insulin. Well, instead of starting to come back down, the glucose values just keep going up. And that's a very, very helpful visual. And I'd like to do that. If we're able to do it next week, that'd be good.
Sure. No problem.
To
We can
continue to go a little
complement.
bit deeper into this subject.
Yeah.
Again, this is so core to what we do. It's very helpful to start having folks understand a little bit more about what's going on.
Yeah. And just a quick comment on the OGTT for glucose values. Usually, for diagnosis of diabetes, you should have 200 or more anytime, or 140 after 2 hours. That's what the guideline says. 140 or more after 2 hours, or 200 at any time. And we are more strict than that because if you have less than that, if you have 140 1 hour, 180 at 1 hour, you are being resistant already. Maybe you don't have full blown diabetes, but definitely you have insulin resistance.
There's a good book by Jenny Rule. I think it's Ruhl. Um, and it talks about, one of the chapters talks about, okay, at what level do we tend to get damage to our arteries? And she does a pretty good job in terms of going back and looking at the science and the evidence. And she would say, once you start spending a lot of time over 140 glucose, you're probably getting damage. Now, she doesn't get into the issue of, that we've talked about it a lot over the past couple of weeks, where hyperinsulinemia with no recorded hyperglycemia still causes damage. But that's what we're doing. We're looking to see, are you going to have too much insulin? Are you going to have too much glucose, especially glucose over 140 for hour after hour at the time? If you do, there's evidence that you're going to be damaging the tissues of your body. So we went a little bit back and forth on this one in terms of getting it ready for today's show. To me, this is the most important slide out of the whole bunch. And basically, it's showing you what Kraft reported in his book. If you're saying, well, I don't think Kraft's book showed a random sample. I don't think it showed true prevalence. It was people that were getting tested. So therefore, maybe that's the problem. Go back and look at others. There are multiple images of glucose metabolism problems by age. And this is the issue. When you're 3 to 13, 14 to 20, and this was like decades ago. That was back in Kraft's age. What was that? 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Yeah.
When these data were being collected, before the current obesity epidemic cranking these numbers up even further. This was just age at that time. So you can see if somebody 14 to 20 years old, 13% had problems with their glucose metabolism. 31 to 40, 24%. By the time you're in your 40s, over a third of you have that problem. By the time you're 60, over half of us have damaged carb metabolism. Into our 70s, 2/3 of us. So it's like, if you're feeling lucky, it's like the old Clint Eastwood scene, Dirty Harry. I've got several bullets left in my gun, or maybe just one bullet. Are you feeling lucky? And I'm not feeling lucky. I think that we all need to know our ability to metabolize carbs, because that's the number one thing that's damaging our bodies, the number one underlying driver for quote, normal aging, quote, if you consider normal aging that you can get into your 60s and have a heart attack unpredicted. Now, again, as I said before, a lot of people would look at Kraft's book and say, well, Joseph Kraft was a pathologist. He ran a large hospital lab in Chicago. And so these people were getting labs because there was some suspicion of diabetes. That's why they were getting these. Just Google it. Go to images, prevalence of diabetes by age, or prevalence of insulin resistance by age, or prevalence of prediabetes by age. And just look at the images. You see all the same kind of huge increase as we age. Another way to look at it would be the UCLA study about 6 years ago, showing that over half of people 30 and above in California had prediabetes or diabetes. And you say, well, gosh, I'm glad I don't live in California. Well, that's not the point either. There was a JAMA study, JAMA Network, which looked at the entire nation, the United States. They saw the same thing. By the time we're age 30, over half of us have a problem with our ability to metabolize carbs. It's incredibly prevalent. It's what this channel is mostly about. It was what it was all about in the beginning, but we've gotten deeper into more prevention programs. We've gotten deeper into providing access through Medicare. So therefore, we've gotten into more types of primary care. But again, the bottom line is this is what's killing people in the United States. It's what's disabling people in the United States. It used to be just what they called a wealthy world or a first world problem. Now it's the thing that you see in India, you're seeing it in China, you're seeing it all over the world as we're getting wealthy enough to afford the food that that we want to eat, and we don't put any barriers on it. So, anything to add?
The world is pushing easier access to unhealthy food,
Yep.
and that's evolution. That's part of the revolution. Not every time evolution is a positive thing. It gives a lot of convenience, comfort, but it's basically damaging us. And if you see the statistics on cause of death, uh, from when there is a start to have some register of what people died like long time ago, people die at the 30s, 40s, but for infections or trauma, and now we live longer, but we're dying slowly. And diet and the way we live has a lot to do with that. And genetics has changed as well with the past with the past years. So
The genetics have changed.
yeah,
Tell me a little
yeah.
bit more about that.
There's an article. I will search that for you. But there are some epigenetic components related to
Uh,
the amount of food that we're eating that are making us more susceptible to cardiovascular events.
Epigenetics. That's why I pushed on that. I thought that might be where you're going.
Yeah.
We change our epigenetics dramatically, and we've covered that a few times. We haven't covered it recently. Um, there's been a lot of development in epigenetics, especially over the past 20 years. For those of you in the audience that don't understand what epigenetics is, it's if you're in that 60s and if you're a boomer, you may remember a thing called the card catalog in the library. It's basically how you go to find things. That's what epigenetics is in terms of our genetics. The genes have not changed significantly, but how we find those genes changes dramatically based on our body, based on our habits and our environments. So, someone who grows up, somebody who's been eating carbs 6 times a day for the past 40 years has a whole different set of proteins set up to metabolize their food. Carbs is a different type of metabolic mechanism. If you get fat adapted, it takes weeks and then sometimes months for some of the adaptations to happen. What's going on there? You're going back and you're changing your epigenetics. You're going back, you're stressing for proteins and enzymes that you have not used that much because you were basically in a different type of metabolism. So, yes, genetics have changed, especially if and your genetics change, especially if you're including epigenetics. So, you're ready to go into
Yeah, we can go to the Q&A.
Q&A?
Just a quick comment, and this is why all of this matters. And you mentioned that briefly. The insulin has actions and components on the vascular tissue. It promotes changes in the artery. The more insulin that you have, remember that we mentioned how insulin has a role on storage in lipids. So it does promote that. It does promote inflammation or is related to inflammation. And that is why diabetes is a metabolic and cardiovascular emphasis on vascular disease. And you see here to the right, this is from Dr. Kraft as well. Hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, endothelial dysfunction, which is damage to the vessels and the glycocalyx, vascular pathology, microangiopathy is damage to small vessels, coronary artery disease, and all the other stuff that comes with that.
We have talked about glycocalyx several times. That's the lining, that's the functional area. That's where the rubber meets the road in terms of metabolic changes. We've also shown some photomicrographs where damaged glycocalyx basically just looks like somebody came through with a lawnmower and just cut it down. Um, remember the root word glyco. So it's a calyx. It's a hairy substance built off of glucose. So having high levels of glucose may, part of the mechanism, I haven't seen the mechanism. I don't know if they have this research yet, but it may just be an issue of um, dissolving those hair-like substances made of glucose. So you ready to give us the transition and go into Q&A?
Let's go to Q&A.
So good morning from Bart, from Rick Folia, from Bobby Ocampo. And Bobby reminds us, hey, somebody reminded us to go ahead and, oh yeah, Bobby did. Give us a like and a share. And that will help us get this information out there.
Yeah, and today was a long show, but we covered a lot of stuff in regards to insulin, diabetes, and the book from Dr. Kraft, which is I think it's a $20 book, right?
Yeah,
it's an easy
yeah,
and worth reading.
yeah. You can tell he's not a polished author, and he didn't have a polished author review it and edit it. But I like the quirkiness.
Yeah, it's like if you're talking to him,
Yeah.
like just like a casual conversation.
Yep.
Alan Laugh from Boise. I'm sorry if I
Boise.
mispronounced that. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm
from Boise. Yeah.
not sure. I'm healthy, 67 years old male, eating healthy, keto, and intermittent fasting for 2 years. I check my blood sugar every day, and most of my readings are between 100 and 120. And even when I eat a meal, it's never gone over 150. What do you think, Doc?
I think he probably has taken the vast majority of diabetes risk off the table. I would much rather, though, be able to actually look at some numbers. I mean, excuse me.
And this is a clear example why Dr. Brewer recovers. This is a clear example of when insulin survey it's going to provide a lot of information, and there is this idea that keto and intermittent fasting will raise your blood sugar levels. There is some truth to that. There is some mechanisms and responses that when you trigger low levels of hypoglycemia, we mentioned glucagon and how glucagon will increase blood sugar. Um, and however, it's not the same that you have 100 and 120 when you are not taking care of anything and you are just eating carbs all day, versus when you are on a low carb diet and you have levels of 100 and 120, even after meals, and not rising above 150. So, uh, generalized, I think those are really good numbers. There are more stuff to look for, of course, and there might be some other things that might be able to be done. Diet and lifestyle are really important, are the most important thing, but sometimes there's other stuff to do.
Again, I think he's taken most of the risk for this issue off the table by controlling that. But I'd much rather have a standardized test where we can see exactly what's going on.
And of course, Alan, if you would like to see Dr. Brewer as a patient, you can just call to the phone number 859-721-1414. We'll be happy to help you getting set up if you would like to talk to Dr. Brewer for a specific advice. Dennis Williamson, greetings from Westville City, Utah. Can you confirm what Dr. Bigman teaches that glucagon has an advantage over insulin in the liver? Apparently, when glucagon is prevalent in the liver, it dominates. That's a really interesting thought. What do you know something about that, Doc?
I don't. I've heard Ben Bickman a few times. I'm just not familiar with that.
I don't think that's the case. And if it is, I don't think it's that relevant.
Right.
You should know that the liver does a lot of stuff, and both glucagon and insulin can promote storing glucose on the liver. So that they share that function a little bit. And I'm not saying this is not true. I don't think it's that relevant, the effects on the liver as it is on the rest of the body. Um, uh, this might be something that relates to glucagon promoting breaking glucose storage in the liver, but insulin does that as well. So
We did a few. There's been a lot of attention put on NAFL, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, some other related liver diseases. Um, liver disease associated with diabetes and obesity has become bigger than liver disease associated with alcohol. The bottom line is there's a lot of focus on it, but the treatment's really simple. You start dropping those carbs, you start losing weight, and you treat all of the liver related problems associated with this. Very simple.
Melissa, do you think elevated LP little a causes systemic inflammation as well as inflammation in your arteries? I know you do have an opinion on that.
I do. LP little a, for those of you who are not familiar, is just a genetic variation of LDL. I have, given what I do, I have a ton of people that have very high levels, some 800 and higher. When you do get those really high levels, that matters, and you get some things like aortic valve stenosis. But for the vast majority of people, it's probably more what Jesus, the analogy that we've heard before, and that Jesus and I tend to use, and that is, you see a fire at a house and you see people around it. Is it the fire department or is it the arson? And a lot of people would say maybe that LP little a is increasing because of inflammation, not so much that it's causing the inflammation. The vast majority of people that I see with LP little a problems are in the areas of 80 to 150. And those are really, really low numbers to be driving a significant risk problem. You won't see that on the LP little a site, but that's true.
Yeah, and you should worry when you have those LP little a levels really high, like 250 or more. Melissa, I forgot how much you said you should take to lower LP little a. I think she's talking about niacin,
I think
and
so too.
we have explored that in the past. How many people say that you need 2 grams daily, but the truth is we have seen evidence that even 250 daily can help you with that. Of course, the more you take, the more effect you're going to have, at least on this case. It's not true for everything, but for niacin it is. But we also go into the side of the side effects of niacin, which can impact the liver, can make that rash and pain in the scalp of the face, well, the part of the face, the front, and the forehead, and the scalp, the niacin flush. And that's why we usually recommend starting low, and then you can increase as we move on and see the effects. Something to add, Doc?
No, I'm waiting for the next one.
Just Rusty. You were. I'm gonna read that a little bit slowly if you want. Just Rusty. One problem with Kraft insulin survey. Many doctors don't know how to interpret it. My doctors pretty much shrugged it at one, and I took that I have since I learned had clear signs of significant insulin resistance. I can agree more with Just.
There was a guy that used to work with us a lot, did a great job, John Lorscheider, and he did his own insulin survey, took it to his doctor, and he reported it on this channel. His numbers went up to like 350. And when he showed it to his doctor just looked at it, shook his head, and said, well, these tests are rigged to fail. And therefore, I still think you do not have diabetes. And it's like, oh, yes. How much worse could they be at interpreting that test?
Yeah. Greg Scaffy, could you comment on the effects of osteoarthritis on cortisol and blood glucose levels? Not sure. Have you seen anything like that? Because there are two things. There is the degenerative osteoarthritis, which is because of damage to the cartilage of the knee or the elbow or whatever, or spine, and that's because constant trauma and aging. But there's also autoimmune arthritis, which does have a role on inflammation and blood glucose levels. Not sure if she's talking about that one.
Exactly. So there are two types of arthritis. One is degenerative, which is usually osteo. The other one is inflammatory arthritis, or as Jesus said, autoimmune. The classic autoimmune ones would be rheumatoid arthritis. The one that I see more often is psoriatic arthritis associated with psoriasis. Those two actually have the inflammatory arthritides actually have significant risk for cardiovascular disease, as much as diabetes. So I have a lot of patients where I'm following them. Their rheumatologist, their arthritis doctor, is following them for cardiovascular inflammation using HSCRP. And obviously we're using HSCRP as well. Now, up until a couple of years ago, I thought there was really no significant inflammatory component to osteo, but in reality, they have actually started to chip away at that and started to show a couple of points of some inflammation in that area. It's still not like what you see with the inflammatory arthritides, and it still is not associated with the risk for cardiovascular disease that you see with the inflammatory arthritides, again, rheumatoid and psoriatic arthritis.
The other thing that I will be the only thing where I will see connection between osteoarthritis and cortisol and blood glucose levels, if your osteoarthritis, especially on the knees or the spine, is too bad, it's too severe, that it doesn't allowing you to exercise. But that's an indirect connection.
Yeah.
Bobby Ocampo, Dr. Canberry is recommending C-peptide tests to determine normal insulin and abnormal insulin level. If I may, just so people are a little bit aware of that, we didn't discuss that on the short slide. I should have mentioned that. Insulin has like 42 or something like that steps to be produced, and it's a long chain of polypeptides that are connected each with the other one until they're the specific amount of polypeptides that compose the whole molecule of insulin. C-peptide is one of those components that help connect that stuff inside the beta cells of the pancreas. And it has been studied as a marker for insulin resistance. Basically, the idea is if your C-peptide is low, that means that you're not producing enough insulin. You don't have enough proinsulin, which is before the insulin molecule. And if it's too high, you are producing too much insulin. That's the idea. It's just basically looking behind or before the production of insulin. Not sure how to connect production with performance. So we don't use that much, but I don't know, Dr. Brewer, if you have another.
You get that topic coming up a lot, and the classic. So the short component is yes, C-peptide is a marker of insulin because it's part of the amino acid chain that connects the two amino acid chains of insulin. It gets pulled out in order to create the insulin to activate the insulin. The classic use for C-peptide was back when you had patients on insulin and you were trying to figure out how much they were making internally, because the insulin that you gave did not have the C-peptide. The insulin that they were making did. You continue to see these things pop up where people get these ideas about, well, here I could just use C-peptide because that's going to tell me a little bit about how much insulin we're making. Those tend to be suggestions that are made by people that just don't watch this testing. I mean, they're not doing this testing on a regular basis on people as much. And they don't have quite the, so they still have questions. Well, how much insulin is this person actually making? We get a really good picture of it given the way we do our testing. I am going to have to leave in 5 minutes.
Well, 5 minutes it is. Bobby
Okay.
Ocampo, Ben Bigman presentation on the ratio of insulin to glucagon ratio. Ideal is less than 1, and breaking fast with meat will further reduce the ratio, meaning glucagon is greater than insulin. I mean, it's
I feel the same.
It's good to measure glucagon if you wanna, like, if you're curious about that specific topic, and we know that glucagon has a big impact on modulating the response to insulin. So that's important, of course. I don't see glucagon having such a clinical significance as insulin does and glucose does.
And again, as we mentioned earlier on, that glucagon is driven more by lifestyle, just like insulin is. If you're overeating, overcarbing, you're getting too much insulin. If you cut those things out, you start getting more of a glucagon type function, which of course is better, especially in this world where most of us are getting damaged by too much insulin.
Yeah, it's just an ally for you to decrease those blood glucose levels. Melissa, what is a good fasting insulin? Mine was 6.7 microunits of overall. Okay, is that okay? We mentioned that we look for an optimal of less than 5. Of course, the labs have their own ranges, but we look for to get that below 5, and that's just one component. It's not like we are aiming with every patient to, hey, you should have a fasting insulin below 5. But if we see that, we know that's a good place. The more important thing will be, how is your insulin responding to carbs after you challenge that? Bobby Ocampo, one of the problems with doctors is prescribing insulin injections even if the patient has already high insulin levels. They don't just prescribe based on A1C. They don't test, just prescribe based on A1C. And yeah, you see that a lot. And I can tell you in Mexico, we have a lot of that. And I can tell you the logic behind that is they say, okay, they have a lot of insulin, but it's not working. So you have to put insulin that works. And that's the idea behind that. But that extra insulin is going to drive more insulin resistance. So I don't see that as a solution. And that's something that I changed my mind of, because I was taught otherwise. I was taught that the patient is not responding to anti-diabetic drugs, they need insulin. That's what I was taught. And now I'm more on the side of the patients that do not want to be prescribed insulin.
Insulin could and should be used much, much less. And lifestyle is the key. I mean,
And sometimes it's
obvious.
necessary. Sometimes it's necessary,
Yes.
especially those severe cases that there's no way to bring them down. What is the highest blood glucose levels have you seen on a patient, doc?
700.
Yeah.
In an outpatient setting, 350.
Yeah. In the ER, you see, I have seen 800 on the ER.
Yeah.
And but even there, insulin is not your first step. Even there, you have other things that you should do to take care of the emergency. But in some cases, they are discharged with insulin being prescribed to them until their primary care doc sees them. And that's just because we're talking about severe cases that are near death. That's what happens there. Janice Janssen, any thought?
Before you go on, just to comment back to Melissa. Melissa, at a fasting insulin of 6.7, you're pretty close to optimum, 5 or less. But as Jesus said, the real, that's important. because a basal insulin of 30 or 40 can drive significant problems like the inability to burn triglycerides, which we talked about a little bit earlier in the show. Also, as Jesus said, the real challenge, there's critical information missing here, and that is, what is your insulin going up to when it's challenged?
We had a $20 super chat from Thomas Handyside. Thank you so much. It does help a lot. It does come a long way. Those $20 for the team that we are hosting the stream, myself and other people working at PrevMed. I know you have to leave. If you can, let's just address this last one and we leave. Any thought on baby aspirin for cancer prevention? I saw some studies about that. It helps in some types of cancers. I have it right here.
It does.
Stomach, colorectal cancer, lung, pancreas, esophagus, and leukemia. No impact on kidney cancer, bladder cancer, prostate cancer, and breast cancer. But this is just one study that I saw. I think the research is still in, and it might help in some types of cancers. That's what I can say about that.
I would agree. It's a fairly weak evidence message or signal right now, but it is real. And so the thing is, so many people are on a baby aspirin or need to be taking a baby aspirin because they do have cardiovascular plaque. You probably do get some added benefit in terms of some cancer prevention. The one that Jesus mentioned is the most prevalent and that this impacts is colorectal cancer.
So just a reminder, if I don't think we're going to be able to go in to see all the questions for today. Some options, just bring your question at the beginning of the show. Give us a super chat like Thomas Handys did here, or become a YouTube member. That way we will be able to see your question before. Any other thing to add, Doc?
Nope. It was a good show. Thank you much. And I'd like to, at some point, we can probably do it during a short, just show the actual graphs where you have insulin level and then glucose level and glucose pattern that follows from that. I think that's very, very helpful.
We can do that for next week, I think.
Sounds good. Thank you
again. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.